Alright, what is going on? Today I'll be doing a video counting down what I believe to be the 13 best old school death metal albums. And it's been quite a long time since I've done any reviews or done a video talking about any physical media, and I will put something small in the description about why I stopped if anyone's wondering. But for the most part, we're going to get right into this video. A couple years ago I did 13 old school death metal classics, and this list has a few repeats, but for the most part this is the list that I believe to be the 13 best old school death metal albums. And after reviewing music for years on the internet and being involved in the online metal community, I have come to the conclusion that my thoughts on music are the best and the most objective. So this list of 13 is fact, and if you disagree, it isn't correct. Just kidding. But we have real quick 3 honorable mentions before I get into the list. I'm just gonna breeze through them super fast because I want to talk mostly about the actual list. But honorable mention number 1, Been Caught Buttering by Punch and Stench. Cool grind-esque old school death metal with like a really interesting aesthetic. It was pretty nasty, pretty cool album, just missed the cut barely. Next is Entombed, Left Hand Path, another absolute classic gem in the Swedish scene. Really well written, really heavy stuff, but I just think the other albums on the list had a little bit more in terms of songwriting and whatnot, but definitely an absolute classic. And then the final honorable mention is Tears of the Unborn by Apoplexy. This came out in '95, I believe, and this is old school death metal that has a lot to offer in terms of melody and really memorable guitar work, nice flow of the album. Pretty underrated gem. That's Apoplexy, Tears of the Unborn. And now we are in to the actual list. So starting this off at number 13 is Sentenced, Shadows of the Past, which came out in I think it was 91 or 92. I might get some of these dates wrong. But yeah, Sentenced was a Finnish band, and this was their debut album. And this definitely has that Swedish style of riffing, both in like the guitar tone and some of the stylistic stuff. But to me, where this album really stands out is through the melodic lines and the guitar work. There's a couple parts on here that kind of remind me of like Dissection and steer a little bit towards the blackened aspect of like how much bright melody is coming through. But this is undoubtedly death metal because some of the riffs on here, especially with that like chainsaw guitar tone, sounds so good. Rot to Death is one that comes to mind, where you have these like fuzzy sounding chugs and the drums are just doing these big flams on the toms. It sounds super big and heavy. And this album's got really good flow. I think the A side is a little bit stronger, but for the most part, I think this is a big standout in the Finnish death metal scene, mostly because of the melody, but also because of the songwriting flow and the really heavy chugging guitar riffs and a great guitar tone. So at number 13, starting this list off, is Shadows of the Past. At number 12 is Suffocation, Effigy of the Forgotten. This is a band that could really fit into the old school or brutal tag, but I think, you know, given that all these albums came out at around the same time, it would seem weird to exempt Suffocation from this list. But at the same time, it would be weird to put like Pierced from Within on here, because I do think they are kind of different styles, and I prefer Pierced, but I think this fits the list better. And of course, Effigy of the Forgotten is a beast of an album, and it is an amazing album in its own ways. Clearly this band was a standout in how they kind of incorporated you got your blasts here, you got your slow chugs here, and it would clearly set the blueprint for a lot of brutality to come. But to me, this is undoubtedly old school death metal. Some absolute classics on here, Legion of Inveracity. My personal favorite is Seeds of the Suffering. And Suffocation just had great guitar work. For the time that it came out, I'm going to say it was definitely very technical. Maybe by today's standards, it's not so much. But these were clearly dudes that were like pushing the limit on how impressive and flashy they could get on their instruments while still being really brutal. You know, Frank Mullen's vocals, to me, they sound like the most heavy on this album. I don't know if he was cupping the mic or something, but they sound super condensed. And yeah, this is just really heavy album that has definitely survived the test of time. So coming in at number 12 is Effigy of the Forgotten. Number 11 is The Key by Nocturnus, which I believe came out 90, 91, I think somewhere around there. And this is a really hot take, but I prefer this album to anything like Morbid Angel ever did. And why this album stands out to me is the first part is the songwriting flow is really good. I really like how the track listing moves through the album, and also how it relates to, you know, the concept behind this album. And I also really enjoy the use of keyboard work in this. And it's not one of those things where a lot of bands would use keyboards, but it would be as like a novelty or like an interlude thing. Nocturnus was actually using the keyboard as like a major part of their songwriting style, which I thought was super unique. I think the best example of that is Neolithic. A lot of cool keyboard melody that really drives the song. And another thing I really like about this album is it had a little bit of a thrashy vibe. I think that was Mike Browning's yelled vocals, which I really, really enjoy, and I think they fit the sound of this well. His drumming sounds good, and some of the songs have like these really frantic and random tempo changes, and I think that just contributes more to the vibe of this like spaced out and like trippy album that's still kind of rooted in like traditional death metal. So I think this balances a nice meter between being familiar, but also if you really listen to it, you're like, yeah, this is pretty like weird and off-kilter stuff. Even though Nocturnus, I still say they fit for the most part with their other contemporaries, but I really enjoy this album. So number 11 is Nocturnus's The Key. And now number 10 is Seance for Never Laid to Rest, which came out in 1992. And this band was from Sweden, but most people describe them as playing the Floridian style of death metal, which I think is a pretty accurate way to describe this group. And I do believe that they outdid a lot of their Floridian counterparts. The guitar work on this album is of a lot of tremolo picking, and then, you know, you have your slow chugs, but it's not in like necessarily the Suffocation sense. But I think this album has a lot of energy. I will say, I think sometimes if you listen to the whole thing, the songs blend together a little bit. But where this really shines is like the energetic effort of the guitar work. If you listen to the second song, Reincarnage, that opening riff is like everything I want in old school death metal. You know, you have these like dissonant chugs and tremolos and these really cool sounding drum cymbal chokes. And I think this is a really good album in terms of songwriting. It's not amazing, but the overall sound quality is enough for me to believe it deserves a spot on this list. So definitely an awesome record. That's Seance for Never Laid to Rest at number 10. At number 9 is Cause of Death. I think Seance outdid some Florida bands, not all. And this was one of those albums that I think is on this list, both because I think it's so well written, but because it had such an impact on getting me more into the genre and, you know, being like exposed to death metal for the first time. You know, I have a lot of memories with these albums, but this one is one that probably I have one of the most with. When I first heard the opening song, Infected, you know, you got that really like drawn out intro, and then it speeds up and the riff kicks in. And great songwriting on here. To me, the highlight is John Tardy's vocals, you know, very unique sounding. And in terms of the vibe of this album, it fits really well with some of the more chunky riffs. And James Murphy's guitar solos on here are super well done. I think to this day, he was one of the best soloists in metal. Yeah, and also I really do prefer the Circle of the Tyrants cover they did on here. You know, when I first heard it, I thought Obituary wrote that song, and when I would go back and listen to the Celtic Frost recording, I would just be like, I know it's maybe an unpopular opinion, but man, I wanted to listen to Obituary. And this is meat and potatoes death metal at its best. The songwriting's well done, but it's just like chunky riffs, and, you know, the band comes together on so many levels here. So this is an absolute classic. Obituary, Cause of Death at number 9. And at number 8, we have Demolic with Nespith. That is the original artwork. And this album came out in 1993, and it was another Finnish release. And even when this came out, and in my opinion, by today's standards, Demoli was a standout band for a variety of reasons. The first and most prominent being the vocals. You know, this is like old school death metal, but it basically had slam vocals. You know, you got the really low, like froggy sounding vocal patterns, but at the same time they were really articulate, and you could like still follow along with the lyrics. And the guitar work, as well as the rhythm section work on bass and drums, was also a standout. The guitar parts were super dissonant, but in a really random way. A lot of pinch harmonics, some like weird rhythms that were hard to decipher on the drums. And through all this chaos came like a really cohesive and easy to listen to death metal album. And I don't mean that in a bad way, because there's plenty to unpack when you listen, but it doesn't feel like a mess. And I know, I think these guys said they would like play some riffs like backwards and do all these like weird stuff. And yeah, this album both has great playing, great songwriting, but also a great atmosphere. The song titles are super random and super weird. I think my favorite on here was The Putrefying Road and the 19th Extremity, Somewhere Inside the Bowels of Endlessness. Yeah, there were a couple tracks on here where these riffs will just like stick in your head for days and days. And it's been a long time since I've listened to this album, but just reading through the track list, I can remember all these bizarre sounding riffs. Yeah, really, really impressive album, and I think it stands the test of time for sure. This is Demoli, Nespith from 1993. At number 7 is Incantations, Onward to Golgotha from 1992. I love this album for a lot of reasons, and one of the first one is the drum work. There's a lot of blast beats on here. There's not a lot of skanks like a lot of the other bands were doing. And one thing that really stands out to me is the production. Before I heard this album, like I was listening to a lot of the more sound bands, which had tighter and punchy production, which I love. But when I first put this on, it was like I heard the blast beats and it just felt like they were echoing over this massive sounding production. And that's what this album is. It sounds absolutely massive. And you have these like mid-pace, slower blasts, but with double bass over it. And of course, I'm a huge fan of John McEntee's guitar work. And on this album, there are like so many dissonant, random riffs that pop out of nowhere. God, I can't even remember which song it is. I think it's, I want to say it's Unholy Massacre, maybe, but there's this track I'm thinking of where they're playing slow, and then it's like just the most random transition. They go into a blast with a super dissonant riff. And when I was playing in my old band, Putrid Tomb, this was a huge influence on me. Really well written. I think all the songs like stand well on their own, but also cohesively. When you listen to the whole album, they come together super well. My favorites on here are the intro track, Blasphemous Cremation, and Rotting Spiritual Embodiment. That might have been the one I was thinking of. I think that one was my favorite. Also, the harmonic work on here is super cool. Like the pinch harmonics sound really eerie and creepy. And I think one thing that this band did, which influenced death metal more than a lot of people talk about, is like they'd be playing chugs and then they'd hit some pinch harmonics, but it would be like in the tritone interval, but they'd start with like the upper one and then go down a diminished fourth, which I think I hear a lot of bands do, and my ear always says, oh, these guys did it first. This is where I've heard it on this album. Maybe not, but Incantation, regardless, delivered an absolute banger with Onward to Golgotha from 1992. And at number 6, we have Convulse, World Without God. I love this album a lot. And it's funny because if someone described this album on paper, I would be like, okay, you know, I can get behind it, but I don't know if it would make this list, yet alone be in the top half. But it really does. This album is super simple, but it just comes in with like so much energy and so much passion. My favorite part about this album is probably the vocals. They sound super low and guttural, and it's almost like when I describe it, I want to say there's nothing special about it. But this is one of those albums where, you know, it's not flashy. The instrument playing is cohesive, but it's not really impressive. It's just like the vibe and the overall heaviness, and it kind of sounds like misanthropic in a way, especially with the theme. One thing I also find really interesting about it is it's one of those albums where I think they were trying to play in C sharp, but it's like so flat. It's like borderline C, but my brain is still hearing it in C sharp. So like when they hit the first chords to like World Without God, to me, like my ear just hears like the most out of tune guitar ever, but it sounds so cool because it's just like so bizarrely flat. And I don't know if I'm just like tripping out or if it's really like that, but when I do play along with it, like it's definitely in the quarter tone region. But yeah, super great album. My favorite on this one is Putrid Intercourse. I also do like the little acoustic stuff they put in at the last song, and also the really neat keyboard intro. So yeah, this is Convulse, World Without God. One of the best old school death metal albums. I can listen to this thing over and over again, and I never get sick of it. All right, and at number 5 is Autopsy's Severed Survival from 1989. This album changed so much for me and what I wanted to do with, you know, my music and where I wanted to go in terms of like listening to more death metal. This thing just launched me into the genre, and for good reasons. You know, people describe Autopsy as like the Black Sabbath of death metal, and I can definitely get behind that because this album uses like a lot of your, even though they were doing it pretty early on, tropes like trem riffs and, you know, some dissonant sounding stuff that would become pretty standard in the genre. But what I really liked is how they use these like big doomy riffs, and the best way to describe it is just like Black Sabbath with death metal vocals over it. Yeah, really, really fun album. And some of the riffs on here are like kind of bluesy even, especially with some of the lead work. You know, you have these like blues licks, which I think is really cool. And the atmosphere it creates is awesome. It sounds like this album cover, which I love. It's just, you know, from Hellraiser, but my favorite part about it is like for some reason the background is like completely black. It reminded me of, this is going on a tangent, but it is relevant to describing the album. I think it was Mortal Kombat like 8 or 9. When you do a fatality, instead of you doing a fatality on the map, the background would go just like completely black. And that's what this reminds me of. It makes it so eerie. And that's just what this album sounds like. You're listening to gore on a completely like black background, if that makes sense. And my favorite songs from this one were intro song, Charred Remains, Service for a Vacant Coffin, Pagan Savior, Critical Madness. So many great songs on here. Yeah, this album really did change my life. This is Autopsy, Severed Survival from 1989, and that was number 5. All right, now we're getting near the end. Number 4 is Malevolent Creation's 10 Commandments from 1991. A really, really impressive album, and these albums near the end are all that I think super highly of, both in terms of like guitar and drum work and vocal work, but really what you're going to hear me talk about a lot is like the songwriting, which for me has always been the biggest factor in deciding if I like really love a band. And Malevolent Creation hits the nail on the head with this album. You know, their other album, Retribution, is probably just as good, but I think the cohesiveness and how this flows is much better. And you know, the vocals on here they're a lot more yelled. They're not like growled or anything, but that doesn't take away any of the intensity whatsoever. And I think the riffing style of this band is like a lot more akin to like Suffocation, or even more of that style, rather than like, you know, people will call this like thrashy old school death metal, and I can kind of hear that with the vocals, but the guitar work is pretty extreme. There's a decent amount of blast beats, and yeah, like the vocals don't do anything to take away from the heaviness. If anything, they add to it. And you know, you have these like lower yells that will reach into these like high screams, and it sounds really amazing. Favorites from this one, what was the intro song is my favorite for some reason. Premature Burial, Multiple Stab Wounds, Injected Suffrage. That song goes hard. There's like really cool bass work on here, pretty good bass work throughout this whole album. And to me, I love Retribution. I think that has probably like maybe more like heavier and like crazy moments, but I think the band is just like so locked in and the songwriting is so perfect, and it's just an album that I keep coming back to and I really look up to in terms of, you know, the old school death metal style and whatnot. So at number 4 is Malevolent Creations, The Ten Commandments from 1991. And number 3, which I do not have with me, but that's fine. I do own it, but I forgot to bring it down, is Deteriorates Rotting in Hell from 1993. And this is, in my opinion, the best like underground old school death metal album. It kind of takes all of my favorite bands and like mashes them up. Like you hear a lot of Cannibal Corpse, a lot of Immolation, and that's why I think I liked listening to it so much, because it was like all my favorite bands coming together, but at the same time you had sort of a new product. Like the vocals sounded really weird. I remember there was, I don't know if this was true or not, but someone was saying he recorded his vocals with his like kids sleeping in the other room, so he had to do these like whisper vocals, which I don't think is true, but it kind of makes sense because the vocals sound really strange, and it's definitely a point of criticism for some people, but I think they came out really well done, especially when he'll do like some like weird throaty lows and then just rip into like a high scream. Really fun album. And yeah, I think my favorite track on here was Cannibal Autopsy. I want to say it was the third one. I don't have it in front of me. But yeah, that one was really good. And also the last track. Just so many memorable moments on this album. It's definitely a fun listen. And coming in at number 2 is Deicide's Legion. A super intense slab. And to me, the best example of Floridian death metal. And yeah, this came out, I said 92. And by today's standards, this thing is super intense. I think the production like really sends it over the edge because it sounds super clean. But like the kick drum sound blends super well with Glenn Benton's bass. And when Glenn does like the layered low and high vocals, it just sounds absolutely terrifying. And you know, the speed that this band was playing at, I think for the time it came out, was probably definitely one of the faster, if not like the fastest bands. Like, you know, the blast beats on here are like super impressive, and I think this album just has great songwriting, but also why it is so high on this list is because like the sheer intensity and evil vibes it gives off. Once again, Satan Spawn the Cacodemon intro song is my favorite. But other good ones on here are, I know Dead But Dreaming was a popular one, Holy Deception, Revocate the Agitator, the last song. I think that one is like the craziest. And that's another reason why I like this album. It builds, and then I think Revocate the Agitator brings like the most energy. It's just this like final climactic closing moment. And you know, after this, they had some cool albums, but like, it is just so hard to top this album, especially like with what was going on in the scene at the time. Like I think obviously you can find ways to like outdo this and like play faster and play heavier, but for the time it came out, this is like an album that is just like a huge gem because it is really hard to imitate the energy and the vocal style and the guitar work. So to me, this album is definitely given the number 2 spot for the reasons of like intensity and evil atmosphere. So at number 2 is Legion. And now at number 1, after being into old school death metal for probably close to 6 or 7 years, I do believe this to be the best old school death metal album, and it is Gorguts, Erosion to Sanity from 1993. I should know that. And yeah, the reason why I'm giving this the tag as the best old school death metal album is because of the songwriting. Consider Dead had amazing songs, but I think this is the best example of how you like go about structuring both the format of your individual songs, but also like the album as a whole. This was 9 songs, or 8, yeah, 8 songs, which I think is the perfect length for death metal albums. And each song kind of had this like individual persona that contributed to the album in its own unique way. So you can like listen to the songs individually, or when you listen to them as a whole album, it feels like they had a vision in mind, and each song they're like checking it off, but in this really way that flows really well, and at the same time is really extreme and really heavy. Maybe controversial take, but I think like the riffs on here outdo Effigy of the Forgotten in terms of like how heavy they are. Especially like the way the rhythm section is so locked in, like the drum and like bass chokes on some of these riffs are so good. And not to mention, I think the lead work is like a huge standout. Especially nowadays, like I've been corrupted by like slam and brutal death metal, where like I could care less about solos. But when I listen to this album, I'm like, yeah, like Luke LeMay and the other guitarist whose name I'm blanking on. I think Sylvain Marcrux, maybe. That was probably a terrible pronunciation. But those two guys, like they had these trade-off leads, and it just sounded really amazing. Yeah, my favorite songs on Orphans of Sickness, that was the one that I first heard. And you hear those blast beats and these like really, I am gonna say this is like pretty technical guitar work, especially for the time that it came out. It just like blew me away, and I was like, I want to play music that's like this, enough of the slow riffs. I want these like really intricate and well-written guitar riffs that both highlight like the complexity of songwriting, but they do so much to like steer the song, and they steer the vocal pattern. It's very rooted in like some of these song structure ways where it's not super complicated, but it's also not one of those ones that's just like whatever, verse, chorus. And yeah, this album is something else. I do believe it is the best old school death metal album. Really good bass work, and also like some novelty stuff, like the intro of Condemned to Obscurity is on the piano. You also have some really cool acoustic guitar work on Dormant Misery. And yeah, just a super tight sounding album. And it is the best in my opinion, but it is also probably my favorite at this point. So if anyone else has any albums that I missed, I know there were some I couldn't get to. Like I do think Tomb of the Mutilated should have been on this list, but I just completely forgot. But that is my pick for the top 13 best old school death metal albums. Thank you for watching.